Hi everybody, Mr. Wada here, and today we're going to be going over the carbon cycle. Alright, so there's a lot to take in there. And to start, this is true. It will take an extremely long time for us to undo the negative effects, and by we I mean the planet, to undo the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. Now, everyone always talks about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but they skip a couple of extremely important facts. So I'm going to actually skip ahead a little bit here and then come back to the beginning. But the ocean holds about 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. And that just has to do with the fact that there is a lot that's dissolved in the water that you wouldn't necessarily think is dissolved in the water at first, like oxygen and carbon dioxide and other gases and things like that. But those are the two we're going to care about the most for here. We'll get back to that later. But for now, so what the carbon cycle is exactly what its name implies. It's where carbon is and how it moves from place to place. And as you saw in the video, it can move around for a bunch of different reasons. The key factors that we're concerned about when talking about this are CO2, carbonates, which are sequestered carbon. They're usually solids. You're going to find it in things like shells and rocks. And with increased acidification in the ocean water being more acidic, acids are good at dissolving carbonates. So if you get more acid, you turn carbonate into carbonic acid, which is bad, which we'll get to in a bit. So the basic idea is you take some sort of solid carbon, whether it's from a fossil fuel or something else, a living organism, it's organic carbon, and it is released into the atmosphere as CO2. And then that CO2 is then taken in normally by organic matter, living things. And it can get trapped in soil and stuff like that as well. But plants will take in that CO2 and then they will turn it into sugar, which is then consumed by living things. And then they die, and you repeat the cycle over and over again. There's also the respiration step, where when something breathes, that includes things that live in the water, they will release carbon dioxide in the process. They take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Okay, so the carbon cycle happens in the water just as it would happen above the ground. It just looks a little bit different because the steps might be in different places. So instead of, getting it directly out of the atmosphere, the things in the water are going to get it out of the water, but the water is getting it from the atmosphere. There is an exchange between the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere. So if you get more CO2 in the air, guess where you also get more CO2? In the water. So they're showing you on the right side here that what I was just talking about is true. You increase the amount of CO2 in the air and you're going to also increase it in here. Same thing is true with everything. Basically, if you get more heat above water, you get more heat in the water. For the ocean steps, so this works the same way. You have carbonates found in the shells and rocks and things like that in the water, and you also have underwater volcanoes, geothermal vents and things like that. Bases of trenches will often open, releasing magma and other stuff. So carbon gets into the water. When marine animals die, they often sink, and in the process, a lot of them that have shells and skeletons release that carbon into the ground as sediment, and that sediment can be upwelled and upturned and sent into higher areas of water, which can then make it up onto shores and can be released into the air that way. It also gets dissolved and brought into the crust of the earth, and in the process brought down further underneath the outer layer of the crust, and then gets eaten up by the mantle, churned into magma, and then you repeat the process again with volcanism. So those cycles that happen above ground also happen in the water in the same way. And there's a lot of interplay between the surface land life and ocean life because of the fact that they're connected by rivers, estuaries, etc. So in order for this to really make sense, though, we need to understand a couple things. First, pH. So pH is measuring the amount of H plus ions, and what that means practically for you right now is that if the number is closer to 0, it's more acidic and there's more H plus, and that's acid. On the opposite side, 14, that's drain cleaner, and you got bleach and oven cleaner and stuff like that near it. That is more basic or alkaline. I know that basic means something different to you than it does to chemistry, but in this case, we're talking about acid base. This graph on the right here is showing how there's rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that correlates with rising CO2 in the ocean and decreasing pH. Now, that may seem confusing at first until you realize that the closer to 0 you are, the more acidic something is. So as the purple and blue lines over here go up overall, there's a staggering going on here, but the overall trend is it's going up. That's what the black line is showing you. That means the pH is going down. Okay, now this has a very large impact on the carbon cycle because there are a lot of things that depend on carbonates that live in the water, like clams, scallops, etc. Anything that makes a shell that has carbonate in it is going to be in much more trouble as you get more CO2. And you can even see it pretty clearly here, because with more CO2 you get more carbonic acid, and with more carbonic acid you get less carbonate because that carbonate is turned into the acid. And as that happens, the shells of things that live underwater get smaller and thinner. There's research going on in Long Island Sound, actually, which is where I got this slide from, a presentation from the Long Island Sound study. And this is just one of many. They were also talking about crabs and lobsters and mussels and all sorts of other things. And the general idea is that things that have hard shells like bivalves suffer greatly from this because they get smaller over time, and they have a much harder time growing because they can't grow the same kind of shell. It takes much more effort now to take that carbon and turn it into carbonate in your shell. If all the carbon is being taken out of the water and brought into carbonic acid and things like that, you lose shell mass, which is bad. When we're talking about carbon in the water, there's dissolved versus particulate, and there's 4 different pools of carbon, and I know that's ironic because we're in the water, but basically you have inorganic and organic. Organic meaning directly tied to a living thing, so like sugar. And then inorganic, like carbon dioxide, meaning it's a thing that can exist separate from the living things themselves. And then you have dissolved and particulate. If it's particulate, it means it's larger. If it's dissolved, it means it's smaller. Dissolved means it can fit through filters. That's a technical definition. On the right side there, you can see the general pattern there. You've got dissolved CO2 flowing back and forth between the surface and the atmosphere. Below it, you've got physical mixing, meaning the water is moving around, mixing it in. And then you have respiration, which is breathing, where it leaves and goes into the water. Farther over to the right, you've got living organisms. So you've got phytoplankton, which will go through photosynthesis. And when they do so, they are going to take in CO2. And as things like that breathe, they are going to release the CO2. Underneath it, you go down to consumers. And when animals take in food, they are eating things that are full of carbon. Well, that's important because sugar is based in carbon. When they eat those things, they are going to break them down and then breathe in the process. And when they breathe, they release CO2, which goes back into that cycle and goes to the next step in the process above it. Each step that you go further down, you're concentrating the amount of carbon that's there. You're also concentrating everything else they take in, which is also why it's more dangerous to eat lots of fish that are farther up on the food chain, because it means they've concentrated things like mercury in the water. Fun fact, that's why if you're pregnant, you're not supposed to eat lots of fish. But yeah, so you keep going down levels there, and as things die and release their excrement, they will also be depositing carbon into the bottom of the ocean there, or whatever layer is below it. And then you restart this process where it gets pushed up into the water, it mixes physically, and then you've got the CO2 mixing back and forth between the surface and the atmosphere. And then to conclude on this, there are a lot of technical terms if you look this stuff up online. Things called biological pumps, which are a biological process that pumps the CO2 around or the carbon around in a cycle. As you can see in the previous pictures here, they're all showing you the exact same process. There's focusing on different parts. The part that I really wanted to focus on here is that what happens on land has a large impact on what happens in the water, because water is so good at dissolving CO2. And as we increase our carbon emissions, we are increasing the amount of carbon that goes in the water.